In May 1948, the British flag was lowered over the city of Jerusalem, ending 30 years of mandate rule. Within minutes, the city became a black hole on the map. No telegrams went out, no supplies went in, and the only road connecting the 100,000 residents of the Jewish quarters to the outside world was severed. But the mystery isn't that the city was besieged. The mystery is how it survived when every military calculation from London to Amman insisted it should have fallen within 72 hours. The crisis began with a paradox. Jerusalem was the spiritual heart of the conflict, yet it held almost no strategic value for a modern mechanized army. It had no heavy industry, no major airports, and its water supply depended on a single pipeline running through hostile territory. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the nascent state, obsessed over the city to the point of distraction, while his generals argued that defending it was a mathematical impossibility. They had no tanks, no artillery, and exactly zero aircraft. Opposing them was the Jordanian Arab Legion, the most professional military force in the Middle East, trained and led by British officers. Investigating the early days of the siege reveals a disturbing pattern of intelligence failures. Documents from the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force, show that they expected a diplomatic solution until the very last second. When the British departed on May 14, 1948, the Jewish commanders in Jerusalem found themselves in charge of a city with only 3 days of flour and a water system that could be sabotaged with a single turn of a valve at the pumping station in Ras al-Ain. The central question remains: why did the leadership allow the city to reach the brink of starvation before attempting a rescue? The first sign of the impending disaster appeared at the Bab al-Wad Gorge. This narrow pass on the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem became a graveyard for makeshift armored trucks. These were not military vehicles, but sandwich trucks, civilian chassis covered with 2 layers of thin steel and wood. On April 20th, 1948, a massive convoy of 300 trucks tried to break through. They were carrying sugar, rice, and ammunition. Halfway through the gorge, the lead vehicle was hit. Because the road was too narrow to turn around, the entire convoy became a sitting target. The conflict intensified at the fortress of Latrun. This was a massive Tegart fort built by the British, sitting on a hill that commanded the entire valley. Whoever held Latrun held the throat of Jerusalem. The Jewish forces launched Operation Bin Nun on May 24, 1948. It was a disaster. New immigrants, some who had arrived at the port of Haifa only hours earlier and didn't even know how to load their rifles, were sent into a frontal assault against the Arab Legion's artillery. The heat reached 40 degrees Celsius. Most of the soldiers had never seen a map of the area. While the battles raged, a secondary investigation was unfolding in the logistics offices in Tel Aviv. Records show that the commanders were receiving conflicting reports. One telegram claimed Jerusalem was falling. Another claimed the city was well stocked. This confusion led to the most desperate decision of the war. If you were a resident of Jerusalem in late May, what would you have done when the water taps ran dry? Share your thoughts in the comments. The disbelief turned to June. The situation moved from critical to terminal. The Arab Legion, under the command of Sir John Bagot Glubb, known as Glubb Pasha, had occupied the old city. The Jewish quarter surrendered on May 28, 1948. The Legion then turned its guns on the new city. 6,000 shells fell on Jerusalem in 24 days. This wasn't just a military operation. It was an economic and psychological strangulation. The daily ration for a resident of Jerusalem was reduced to 600 calories, 2 slices of bread, and a few olives. Technological desperation led to the creation of the Davidka, a homemade mortar that became a legend of the siege. It fired a projectile that weighed 40 kilograms, but had almost no accuracy. Its true value was not its destructive power, but its sound. Because it used an oversized explosive charge, it produced a bang so loud that the defending forces spread a rumor that the Jewish army had developed an atomic bomb. In the chaos of the 1948 war, such psychological warfare was often more effective than actual ballistics. The investigation into the supplies reveals a strange anomaly. While the city was starving, certain high-ranking officials still had access to fresh vegetables and meat. Ledger books recovered from the era suggest a thriving black market where a single egg cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a laborer. The systemic failure of the rationing board created a city within a city, one that was fighting for survival and another that was profiting from the misery. The second major conflict point occurred at the High Commissioner's Palace. This neutral zone, intended for the Red Cross and the United Nations, became a flashpoint when Egyptian and Jordanian forces converged on the southern outskirts. The defenders of the southern suburbs, mostly teenagers from the Gadna youth battalions, were facing tanks with nothing but Molotov cocktails. They held the line at Kibbutz Ramat Rachel, where the territory changed hands 5 times in 48 hours. The maps of the time show a front line that moved not by kilometers, but by meters, from one dining hall to the next. Then came the discovery that changed the course of the investigation. In early June, a group of 3 soldiers from the Palmach, the elite strike force, were scouting the hills south of the main road. They were looking for a way to bypass the fortress at Latrun, which had already repelled 3 major Jewish assaults. They found a series of goat paths leading through the rugged terrain of the Judean hills. These paths were steep, rocky, and completely invisible from the Jordanian positions at the fort. This was the birth of Burma Road, named after the famous supply route in World War II. But here's the mystery. The path was so steep that no truck could climb it. The initial plan seemed like a hallucination. The engineers calculated that they would need to move hundreds of tons of equipment by hand, under the cover of darkness, in a narrow window of 4 hours each night to avoid detection by Jordanian scouts. The pressure reached a breaking point on June 7, 1948. The United Nations was negotiating a ceasefire. If the truce went into effect while Jerusalem was still cut off, the city would be legally ceded to the Arab side. The clock was ticking. Ben-Gurion gave the order. The road must be open within 72 hours, or the city is lost. The human cost was immense. Thousands of men from Tel Aviv were drafted, not to fight, but to carry sacks of flour on their backs. A false hope emerged when a small jeep managed to scramble over the rocks and reach the outskirts of Jerusalem. The news spread like wildfire. The siege was over. But the next morning, the reality set in. One jeep did not constitute a supply line. The Jordanian artillery at Latrun, sensing something was happening in the hills, began blind firing into the valley. A direct hit destroyed the first makeshift pipeline the engineers were trying to lay alongside the path. The third and most serious conflict occurred on the night of June 9th. A massive effort was launched to pave the path using bulldozers and steamrollers. The noise was deafening. It was impossible to keep the operation a secret any longer. Jordanian units began to move down from the hills to intercept the construction crews. The defense was left to a handful of exhausted soldiers who had been fighting without sleep for 3 days. Disaster struck at 3 in the morning. A massive rock slide, triggered either by a Jordanian shell or poor engineering, buried the central section of the new road. The bulldozers were stuck. The trucks were backed up for miles. To make matters worse, a shipment of light machine guns destined for the defenders had been sent to the wrong sector. The soldiers at the Burma road were left with bolt-action rifles against an advancing mechanized company. By dawn on June 10, 1948, the project looked like a graveyard of rusted metal and broken dreams. The ceasefire was scheduled to begin at 10 in the morning on June 11th. The high command in Tel Aviv received a devastating report. The road was impassable. The men were deserting their posts out of exhaustion, and the Jordanians were preparing a final pincer movement to close the gap forever. It appeared the mystery of Jerusalem's survival would end in its total capitulation. The final blow came when the British mediators announced that any movement of supplies after the ceasefire started would be considered a violation, resulting in international sanctions against the new state. The last chance had been missed. The archives of the provisional government show a series of frantic cables between Ben-Gurion and his representatives in Washington. They were looking for a miracle, but the numbers didn't add up. The city had less than 24 hours of water left in its emergency cisterns. Then, an overlooked detail from the first week of the war resurfaced. An engineer named Felstein had been working on a series of underground tunnels built during the British Mandate for sewage. He realized that these tunnels didn't just carry waste, they followed the natural topography of the hills. While the world was watching the bulldozers on the Burma road, a small team of technicians had been quietly laying a thin 2-inch rubber hose through these tunnels and across the gaps in the hills. This wasn't a road for trucks, it was a lifeline for liquid. On the night before the ceasefire, they began pumping, not water, but fuel and liquid grain. While the Jordanian observers saw a broken road and stalled trucks, the city was being fed through a hidden artery. But they still needed the heavy trucks to pass to prove the road was open before the UN observers arrived. The breakthrough happened because of a simple change in strategy. Instead of trying to pave the rock slide, the engineers used the sandwich armor plates from the destroyed trucks of April to create a metal bridge over the loose soil. It was loud, unstable, and incredibly dangerous. At 5 in the morning on June 11, 1948, just 5 hours before the ceasefire, the first heavy truck loaded with 3 tons of flour crested the final hill and entered Jerusalem. The investigation into the official records of the UN observers reveals a startling fact. When they arrived to certify the road, they saw a line of trucks and declared the siege broken. They never realized that those trucks had only made it across minutes earlier, and that the road behind them was already crumbling again. The opening of the road was a masterpiece of timing and bluffing. The final twist is found in the Jordanian military diaries of the time. Glubb Pasha wrote that he had the order to attack the Burma road on the night of June 10th, but he hesitated because his intelligence told him the road was already a failure and not worth the ammunition. He believed the Jewish forces were retreating, not reinforcing. By the time he realized the trucks had made it through, the international ceasefire was in effect, and his guns had to remain silent. The battle for Jerusalem in 1948 wasn't won by a superior army or a secret weapon. It was won by a 2-inch rubber hose, a few sheets of scrap metal, and a series of goat paths that no military map had bothered to include. The fortress of Latrun, the very place that had caused so much blood to be spilled, remained in Jordanian hands for another 19 years, a silent witness to the road that bypassed it. These events and the makeshift path carved through the Judean hills remain documented in the military archives of the Israel Defense Forces under the file name Operation 7.
The struggle for the path to Jerusalem defined